So here we have the Death Shadow deck. So Death Shadow decks have been around for a little while in Modern, but before the previous bannings, the version that was popular of Death Shadow featured Gitaxian Probe and more creatures. Didn't have this Traverse the Ulvenwald Tarfire thing going on, so it was a little bit different. Now the bannings have happened, and the deck Death Shadow, it's still a good card, it turns out. There were some people that thought, alright, Gitaxian Probe is gone, now Death Shadow isn't going to be a deck, and that was not the case. The deck is still very real. In fact, it's arguably the best deck in Modern right now. Just looking at the results from the past weekend, from the past month or two on Magic Online, the deck is for real. Not only did it win the Grand Prix in Vancouver, there were 3 players playing it in the top 4, and the winning player of the SCG team event this past weekend was also on this deck. So the deck really had results that were unprecedented, essentially. This deck has been around on Magic Online for a little while now, but it's been tuned and tuned. Then Fatal Push was printed, and the deck added that to the mix of spells. So, talking about the mana base here, we've got 18 lands, okay? But there's a real focus on the shock lands, the fetch lands, because you want to be able to deal yourself 3 damage every single time you play a land, almost. So more likely than not, you want to be hurting yourself with the mana base just to be able to get that Death Shadow into play ASAP. And so that's why we see so many fetch lands and not as many actual lands. And the reason, by the way, that there's only 18 lands in the deck is that this deck is not mana hungry. So you don't need that many lands to function. You can function on a couple lands and be fine for the entire game. And there's some cantrips. So we've got Mishra's Bauble. It's a cantrip, right? But it's an artifact as well. So just being that additional card type that goes to the graveyard is quite important in the deck. Similarly, Street Wraith is a creature that goes into the graveyard. Sure, you pay 2 life, but it's a free cycle effect that draws you a card. So sometimes with the Mishra's Bauble, you will want to target yourself when you sacrifice it to see what your top card is. And then you see if you want to keep it and draw it, or maybe you want to sacrifice a fetch land or cast a Traverse the Ulvenwald to shuffle your deck instead. So you've got that ability, you've got that decision to make off of the Mishra's Bauble. So of course, for Death Shadow, this is the staple creature in the deck. 1 mana, it can be a 12/12. No, it can't be a 13/13, otherwise you're dead at that point. But it's actually pretty easy to set up the turn you want to kill your opponent to go down to 1 life, to go down to 2 life, to really hurt. You can really hurt yourself and still win off of something like a Temur Battle Rage, and you see a couple of those here. So there's some Fatal Pushes, some removal spells are in this deck. This is one of the premier removal spells in Modern right now, with so many fetch lands and Mishra's Bauble. You're able to kill a creature with converted mana cost 4 or less a lot of the time. There's 8 discard spells in the deck, and this is why the deck is very similar to a Jund mid-range deck rather than the Death Shadow decks we were used to, is because you're really disrupting the opponent as well. So for Thoughtseize, this is the best discard spell because you lose 2 life when you're casting it, but there's also 4 Inquisition of Kozilek as well. And you see just a clump of 1 mana cards, and this means you're casting cards quickly. You always have something to do on turn 1, on turn 2. So there's 3 copies of Tarfire, which this is the one I think that raises the most eyebrows. Why is there Tarfire in a deck that could just as easily be playing Lightning Bolt, right? But the reason why is it's a tribal instant. So there's real value in having that additional card type in the graveyard. And that's why Tarfire gets the nod over the more powerful spell in Lightning Bolt. And then 4 copies of Traverse the Ulvenwald. So you really want to have 4 card types in the graveyard. You can do that quite quickly. And then traversing for Death Shadow. Sometimes you don't already have a Death Shadow, or your opponent maybe has a removal spell for the first one. And this means you're playing more copies of Death Shadow essentially in your deck. But you can also find Warclan Rampager, Tarmogoyf, Street Race sometimes comes up, even a land. So there is some flexibility. And then there's also some sideboard hits for Traverse the Ulvenwald as well. 4 copies of Goyf. This is just the other creature in the deck that you can potentially win with. It's like secondary to Death Shadow, but it's an alternative win condition. And it's pretty routinely a 6-7 or a 5-6 a lot of the time. 2 Temur Battle Rages. Some lists have 3. This one has 2. Normally when you win the game against a creature deck, oftentimes it revolves around this card because you're able to make your Death Shadow huge, and then having a way to trample over, and also the double strike means that even if your opponent's at 20 or a very high life total, one Temur Battle Rage is enough to get the job done. And there's 1 Collective Brutality. This is just kind of a good card in Modern. Not specific to this deck per se, but there is 1 copy. So 2 Liliana of the Veils. There's been lists with Liliana of the Last Hope or Liliana of the Veil in the main. This one has Liliana of the Veil. And I do like Liliana of the Veil in this metagame because against a deck like the Death Shadow deck that doesn't play that many creatures, a lot of time you've just got 1 big creature sitting in play. And so the Edict effect is really good against this sort of strategy. And then a couple Colligan's Command. Of course, it's great against Affinity or any artifact-based deck. But other than that, it gets back your Death Shadow. It helps you fight through removal spells. 1 Warclan Rampager as a trample effect, so similar to Temur Battle Rage. It's a way to win the game with the Death Shadow. And then we already talked about the Street Race a little bit. So the sideboard, it's got some grindy cards, right? So traditionally your opponent is going to fight this deck with a lot of removal. So Lingering Souls is a great answer to those types of mid-range decks. Just making those spirits, then you can flash it back. You can really grind out a game similar to an Abzan style deck, just going discard spell, removal spell, Lingering Souls type of thing. 1 Ranger of Eos. So Ranger of Eos can just go find 2 Death Shadows. So it's kind of like a Traverse the Ulvenwald on steroids, almost. Like, once you get to 4 mana, which 4 mana is a lot in the deck, there's only 1 Ranger, but once you do get there, getting multiple Death Shadows can just overwhelm removal pretty easily. Then there's 1 Liliana of the Last Hope as well. So we see a mix of both Lilianas between main and sideboard. Some Fulminators against Tron decks, which are more popular, Scapeshift. Basically, a lot of decks Fulminator can come in against and be pretty good. Then we have some singleton creatures here to find off Traverse the Ulvenwald. So we've got 1 Kataki War's Wage, which is great against a deck like Affinity or Lantern. 1 Aethersworn Candidates. This is primarily for Storm, which has become a real player in this metagame as well. Another Collective Brutality. Great against decks like Burn, combo decks in general. Ancient Grudges. So we see plenty of Artifact Destruction. And guess what? This deck does have a good matchup against those artifact-based decks. And then a couple of Grafdigger's Cages. So Collected Company decks, Dredge decks, Graveyard decks of various sorts. This card is still good in Modern, even with Dredge being slightly less popular. So this is the Death Shadow deck. It's crushing it. So you gotta pay this deck a lot of respect right now in Modern. And I'm gonna play it here today and help show off its power.